Now, please take a moment to read WHOI's land acknowledgement.
The ocean covers 70% of the globe. It gives us oxygen and food and millions of jobs. It brings joy and shapes our climate and weather. The ocean is life, and it belongs to everyone. Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution is the world's independent leader in ocean discovery, exploration, and education, working to understand and sustain one of humanity's most precious common resources. Join us today for our ocean, our planet, and our future.
Welcome to Ocean Encounters, a virtual series from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, or WHOI, as we like to call it for short. Tonight's event is Ice: Insights from Frozen Frontiers on Earth and Beyond. My name is Veronique LaCapra. I'm the host of Ocean Encounters. WHOI's public event series is now in its 7th season and is once again an endorsed activity of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. If you've tuned in before, thank you for your support. And if you're new to Ocean Encounters, welcome. I'd especially like to thank any WHOI members who are tuning in tonight. You are the heroes at the heart of our efforts. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to let our Zoom audience know that they can participate in tonight's live conversation. If you have a question for one of our panelists, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type your question in the window that appears. You might be more familiar with the chat function in Zoom, but for tonight, please use the Q&A button instead. We often get hundreds of questions, so I apologize if we don't get to yours while we're live. You can ask questions anytime, starting now. And as of tonight, I'm excited to announce that for our Zoom viewers, Ocean Encounters now has live American Sign Language interpretation. To enable the ASL feature, please click on the Interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I also want to let you know that, as always, we are recording this event. That recording will be made available on the whoi.edu website. We had more than 2,500 people pre-register to join us tonight, so you're in very good company. We also have viewers joining us right now on Facebook and on YouTube. To everyone, thank you and welcome. Let's get started. Frozen landscapes have captivated imaginations for generations. But what kinds of life can survive in these harsh environments? What can ice tell us about Earth's past and future? And what could we discover by peering beneath the thick, icy surface of ocean worlds elsewhere in our solar system? Tonight, we're going to hear from 3 WHOI researchers with very different areas of expertise, but whose work all focuses on icy places on Earth and beyond. They are paleoclimatologist Sarah Shackleton, polar roboticist Hanumant Singh, and planetary scientist Elizabeth Spiers. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, Veronique. It's good to be here.
Nice to see you. As I mentioned, you all do very different kinds of work. Sarah, let's start with you. Tell us a little about your research.
Right. So I am a paleoclimatologist, which is just a fancy word for someone who studies past climate. And one of the main tools I use is ancient samples of glacial ice, primarily coming from Antarctica. And one of the projects that I'll be working on at WHOI, which I started as a postdoc, is this quest to find the oldest ice on Earth with this project funded by NSF through the Center for Oldest Ice Exploration.
Okay, so aside from the wow factor of finding the oldest ice ever, why should we care about old ice? What can it actually tell us that, say, ancient ocean sediments or maybe fossils can't?
Yeah, so we don't expect for ice core records to go back beyond those of sediment records. But what's really unique about glacial ice is that it traps direct samples of the past atmosphere in these tiny little air bubbles. And these provide our most reliable records of past greenhouse gas levels. They also provide kind of direct sample of our largest and longest surviving ice sheets. And currently, the longest continuous ice core record goes back about 800,000 years. But unfortunately, it just misses this really important climate transition that happened about 1 million years ago, and then also misses this really interesting interval that went back beyond 2.5 million years ago and beyond, where we know the climate was warmer and quite different from today.
Okay, and we'll dig into all of that later in the show. Thanks, Sarah. Elizabeth, let's go to you. You work at WHOI, where people typically study the ocean here on Earth, but your research is all about other worlds in our solar system. Tell us about that.
Hi, yeah. So I study icy ocean worlds. And so these are bodies in our solar system. Most of them are covered in ice, but underneath them, there's these oceans. And so in some way, I'm extending these oceans on Earth to finding oceans in other places. But importantly, they are covered in ice. And so to understand what's going on in these oceans, we need to look at the ice on top and understand how the ice and the ocean are interacting with each other. But there's also ice is found throughout the solar system, not on just these icy ocean worlds. They're found on comets, ice is found on Mars, ice is found in the outer solar system as well, and it's found in a lot of different forms. It's not just water ice. You have carbon dioxide ice, you have methane ice, you have nitrogen ice. And so there's a lot of different ways that ice is a really important component of bodies in our solar system and the processes that are happening there.
Okay, so say a little more about that. Why are you and NASA and WHOI interested in these icy ocean worlds? What's kind of the end goal, or what are you trying to find out?
Yeah, and the thing we're interested in is the water. And that's because here on Earth, wherever you find water, you typically find life. And so when we're trying to figure out where can we find life elsewhere in our solar system, one of the first places we'll want to look is places with liquid water. And so we're interested in going to these icy ocean worlds and figuring out, are they habitable? Do they have all of the necessary things we might need for life? Do they have the chemistry? We know they have water, but do they have energy sources? And so this is a lot of the research that I'm working on, and others as well.
So they don't just have the frozen water, the ice. We know that they have water underneath that ice.
Yeah, yes, we do. At least, yes, many of them. And so specifically, there's a moon of Jupiter called Europa. That's the one that I mostly study and focus on. And then there's another moon of Saturn that's called Enceladus. And these two bodies in particular, we're really interested in studying because we know that their oceans are potentially a little bit more interesting. We can get into that later on.
All right. Yep. Thanks, Elizabeth. And Hanu, you're a robotics engineer who collaborates with scientists like Sarah and Elizabeth. You've had a long career, so just give us a few examples of the kinds of projects you've worked on and what your role was in them.
So for me, the excitement is actually in building the robots and building them with specific purposes. We've used our robots in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, in Greenland, and then in places that people normally never heard of, such as the Danger Islands. And along with my students and technicians at WHOI and Northeastern and elsewhere, we build the robots. We build them from a mechanical standpoint. We build them electronically. We build the software, and then we go out and actually deploy them in the real world for our scientific end users.
Such great images. All right, I want to go ahead and bring in some audience questions if we've got any this early on. Ken, my colleague Ken Costell is behind the scenes. He's monitoring the Q&A. Have we got any questions yet?
We have one quick question asking, what's the coldest you've been, and does ice get harder as it gets colder?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so I don't know who wants to talk about the coldest they've been. Sarah, how about you?
Okay, I'll start. I think the coldest I've been in the field was about somewhere between minus 35 and minus 40 Fahrenheit. And it was very windy as well, so that's without wind chill. So very cold, and ice does get harder the colder it is. Good question.
All right.
I will say minus 40 is the same in Celsius and in Fahrenheit, and that's where we were in Greenland in April. And usually when people ask me how cold you get, I say, when we're working in the field, the adrenaline kicks in and you don't really feel cold. But when you're in Greenland and it's -40 and the wind chill is below that, much below that, then it's cold. Then it's definitely very cold.
I can imagine. We're having a bit of a cold snap here on Cape Cod, but nothing like that. So, all right, we'll come back for some more audience questions later. In the meantime, Elizabeth, I'd like to go back to you because your work is pretty different from the kind of ocean research we're used to talking about on Ocean Encounters. You can't personally go to the moons of Jupiter or Saturn to study them. So tell us a bit how that works. What are you actually doing in your research?
Yeah, so a lot of the work that I actually do is on the computer, computational modeling. So whatever everybody was saying, the coldest place they've been, I think the coldest I've been is right here in Massachusetts. I've never actually gone into an icy field because most of the work I do is on a computer. But the other way that we do a lot of our research is with spacecraft data. And so recently, Europa Clipper was a NASA space mission that just launched this past October, and it's going to visit Europa. So that's that moon of Jupiter I was talking about. It's covered in ice and there's an ocean underneath. And particularly, we're really interested in finding out how thick is that ice shell. So we know that there's ice on top and we know there's water, but we don't know how thick the ice shell is. So this mission is going to do a number of things. But one of those things it'll be doing is looking at the ice shell and using ice penetrating radar to look at how thick is the ice shell. So the radar is going to come down and it's going to assess the ice shell and detect how deep is that ice shell going to be. So we can figure out how deep is the ocean. And so I'm on the radar team for this mission, and it's currently on its way to Europa. I think it's going to pass by Mars next month, but it'll officially get to Europa in April 2030. So mark your calendars for that.
All right, we got a little ways to go yet. I want to take a second and pause because I'm curious about your career. I read online that as an undergraduate, you studied Mars, but you also studied cell biology. What's the connection and what drew you to study planets in the first place?
Yeah, so I started as a physics major. And while I was a physics major, I was working in a biophysics lab and we were studying kind of cell growth and division rates. And while I was doing that, my university had started up a new major in planetary science. They were trying to recruit people to kind of fill out their classes. And so they came over and they started recruiting the women in physics group. And I was like, this seems pretty cool. I'd grown up near NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So I'd kind of grown up with this love of space and love of space exploration. I was part of an astronomy club when I was really young. And yeah, we do have a picture of that.
I love this picture.
And so I actually started a double major. I continued my physics degree, but I also started a second major in planetary science. And so doing that, I was able to start doing research looking at Mars's composition and doing this kind of research in biophysics on one side and this research in Mars on the other side. It kind of led me to thinking, what kind of environments can life live in? And can we search for life elsewhere? And if we did, what would we look for? What kind of environments would we be looking at? And so that led me to this broader field that's called astrobiology, which is the study of if life exists elsewhere in our universe or in our solar system, where would it be and what kind of conditions would it require to be there?
I love that. When I was the age you were looking through the telescope, the idea of life on other planets was all science fiction, and I love that it's real now. You're relatively new to WHOI. How long have you been here again?
I started just this past October, so it's only been a couple months. Yeah.
Okay. So what drew you here, and kind of help us connect the dots? How does studying Earth's ocean help us understand these oceans on other worlds?
Yeah. So I joined WHOI, and that's to learn about the processes that are happening here on Earth. It's really hard to study these oceans and these planets that are far away. And so by looking at processes that are happening on Earth, we can figure out how we can potentially model them in these planetary environments. And so a lot of the work I've been doing here at WHOI has to do with how water and rock interact. And so this past summer, you can see a photo here, I was able to participate in a cruise with the ROV Jason, and we were collecting samples of hydrothermal fluids. And so that was a really unique experience that I'm really excited to have had. And I could have only have done that here at WHOI. And I'm using that to transfer that knowledge to planetary environments and see how we can connect these to our own Earth and then these ocean worlds far away.
All right, Hanu, you're very familiar with ROVs or remotely operated vehicles, and you've been to a lot of icy places on this planet. Where has your work taken you, and how have the robots helped that you've developed helped to advance the science?
Well, I've actually worked on Jason, and I've worked on a bunch of the really famous vehicles at WHOI, including Alvin. But a lot of the work associated with polar work was with these vehicles called seabed, which we developed at WHOI. And in particular, we've been using them to study all sorts of things. We went to the Gackel Ridge, which is right there in the Arctic Ocean, to look for hydrothermal vents there. Um, we didn't find them, but we did find some really cool stuff that we can talk about later. We went under the ice in Antarctica, and here we are sending our vehicle under ice to measure the underside of sea ice. We can always make measurements from space, with satellites, but the scientists are really interested in seeing what's happening underneath as well as on top. And then we've done all sorts of other things like look at penguin colonies in the danger islands. We've looked at marine life, invasive species, and how they're moving up the coast in Antarctica. Just a bunch of other scientific end goals based on what our users want.
All right. Sarah, so we've been to the Arctic with Hanu. Now take us to the Antarctic on your quest to find the world's oldest ice. What was that like, and how do you do it?
Right. So I just want to say, so this is a kind of big international challenge, this hunt for the Earth's oldest ice, and there have been kind of different strategies that people have employed. But our team, what we do is kind of a more non-traditional method of ice coring. So instead of kind of going to the top of the ice sheet and drilling down to find old ice, we go out to the ice margins where you can find old ice that was previously buried in the interior of the ice sheet that has resurfaced. And these particular areas are called blue ice areas, and they form under kind of specific conditions. And the conditions that are ideal for finding this really old ice near the surface are basically high altitude, very cold, and very windy. So scientifically ideal, but not so ideal for field work. So the field seasons that we do for this project last in total about 2.5 months, about 50 or 60 days of which are in the field. So while we're at our field site, and where we primarily are looking is this location called the Allen Hills. We're basically camping in tents, no showering. We melt our own drinking water from the ice at the surface. We have a lot of drifting snow and wind with really long field days. So we got to find ways to kind of stay sane and positive. Like if the wind dies enough, we can fly kites or go hiking. And so we collect our samples, and once we're back in the lab, we wait for our samples. They take about 4 months to travel from Antarctica to the US. And then in order to date them, because these are non-traditional ice samples, they're a little bit more complicated to date. And so the way that we do it for this project is we measure the amount of argon in the ice bubbles. So argon, and specifically one isotope of it called argon-40, basically gradually accumulates in the atmosphere. And we can basically measure how much less argon is in an air bubble and an ice sample in order to date it. It's a lot of work. You can basically get one date per day and like a full 8-hour day in the lab. So it's slow, but it's always really exciting to figure out how old the ice is that we collected.
So I have a couple questions about what you just said. One was you talked about how in these areas that you go to in Allen Hills, the ice has resurfaced. How does that happen?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So in different locations on the ice sheet, you can have net accumulation of snow. So snow basically builds up over time and moves downward and outward. And then there are locations where you have an outpacing of ablation, so removal of snow and ice over accumulation. And so ice that was basically previously buried gets re-exposed.
Okay, so ablation by wind and
Wind, yeah,
erosion and things like that.
yeah, exactly.
Okay. And then my other question was, when you're sampling these or these bubbles in the ice, the argon gas in the ice, how do you do that? Are you like inserting a needle into, like, what are you doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, to analyze these samples, we melt them under vacuum. So we remove all of the ambient air from the sample container. And then once we do that, we melt it. And then these bubbles basically pop and we trap the gas samples on a cold tube.
Okay. And what was the oldest ice you found?
So far, the oldest ice that we've dated for this project is about 6 million years old.
All right. And Hanu, I know you have a question you're dying to ask Sarah, so why don't you ask
You
it?
know, it's not my question. When we were, talking about this, I look at the question and answers on the chat. And Sarah, you know this one. You know what to expect, right? So I'm going to ask it for all the audience members. Are you by any chance related to that Shackleton?
Yeah, so Ernest Shackleton, right? He is a very famous Antarctic explorer. And Hanu, I did look up uh, the way to explain this right before this in case someone asks this question. So he is my 12th cousin, 4 times removed, which is just extraordinarily distant. Like there are millions of other people who are just as related, but they probably don't know because they don't have the same last name.
But that's
Oh, come
still
on, you
awesome.
should, how can you go wrong with a name like that when you're doing photo?
Exactly. It's meant to be.
It was meant to be.
All right, Ken, how are we doing with audience questions?
Well, Sarah just answered roughly half of the questions that
Ah,
we've been getting in the chat.
okay. Well, that's good.
A lot of questions, though, about the ice of Europa and the presumed oceans. Is the ice of Europa going to be similar in composition to the ice that we know? And how do we know that there is, in fact, an ocean, a liquid water ocean under all that ice?
That's a good question.
Yeah, so I think it's really, really cool. So we know that there's an ocean on Europa because the Galileo mission went and it flew by Europa in the 1990s. And when it did that, it had an instrument called a magnetometer on board, which measured the magnetic field. And as it was going by, it noticed that the magnetic field was just a little bit different than they would have expected. And when they actually looked into the data and they explored it a bit more, they realized that the only way you could explain this shift in it's Jupiter's magnetic field, this like kind of distortion, was that there was this globally rotating liquid saline layer. And so that was the only way that they knew that could explain the signal that they were seeing in the magnetometer data. And since then, we've done a lot of different thermal models. So looking at kind of how cold is the ice and then how hot would the interior be based on what we know about planetary models. And from those, we've been able to say that, yeah, we are pretty certain that there's an ocean there. And so that's kind of this really cool, we never actually physically observed it, but there's all of these different hints and clues that tell us that there's liquid water there. And it is liquid water. The surface ice is also water ice. But there's also these other things on it. So Europa is nearby to this moon called Io. And Io is very volcanic and it's spewing out volcanic material. And some of this volcanic material is falling onto the surface of Europa. So you have kind of these like sulfur species that are kind of dusted on top of the surface ice of Europa. So this is really complex and dynamic environment. And we're really interested to explore it more because Galileo went by, but we didn't actually get that much data. And so the Europa Clipper will be able to tell us a lot more.
Exciting. Anything else, Ken?
Yes, sort of pitching over to Hanu. We have a question asking, how would you design a robot to explore some of those under ice oceans on Europa and Enceladus? given what we know about some simple things like difference in gravitational pull.
So funny you asked that. The reason I got into designing robots for the Arctic is I was part of something called astrobiology, where they were looking for Earth analogs to work that they want to do in outer space. So, when we first wanted to build these robots, they were considered too risky, too high risk to be funded by most people. So NASA and NOAA got together and funded this as an analog to exploring the worlds on Europa. And of course, now what's really cool is having Elizabeth right here. And, we've taken the first baby steps. By 2030, I think I will be retired. I don't know. And it'll be nice to pass on these traditions and these engineering ideas to the next generation.
Cool. All right. So we've talked about why you study icy places, what we can learn from them, and how you do it. Now I want to know what you've actually learned and why it matters. Sarah, you found 6 million year old ice. What did you learn from it and about our past climate and maybe our future climate?
Yeah, so this 6 million-year-old sample that we dated came from the very bottom of this ice core sample. And so it was right near kind of this basal sediment material. And so unfortunately, we have kind of contamination of the CO2 signal for that specific sample. But we are able to learn more kind of information from these samples, including from water isotopes, which gives us information about the temperature 6 million years ago. And what we found is that, and this is what we expect, that 6 million years ago, the climate was substantially warmer than today. So from our samples, our oldest reliable CO2 measurement goes back about 3 million years ago, still a time that was warmer than today. And basically, in order to measure CO2, it's a bit different than what we do to analyze argon in order to date it. Instead of melting it under vacuum, because CO2 is so soluble, we can't just melt it because it just dissolves in the liquid water. So instead, you have to use this dry extraction method. So that involves either kind of physically cracking the ice apart or slowly shaving it down under vacuum to release the gases. So we have these kind of discontinuous pockets of really old ice going back 3 million years ago through kind of today. And so far, what we found is we have not found CO2 concentrations as high as today, which is pretty interesting. But from these climate snapshots, we see that between about 3 million years ago and 1 million years ago, we have this gradual lowering of CO2 along with the lowering of global temperatures. And from what we've learned and what we understand, we think that CO2 is definitely an important driver for this gradual cooling, but it wasn't the sole driver of cooling during this interval. That's not surprising. We know that CO2 changes were not the only driver of warming and cooling associated with the ice ages over the last 800,000 years. And one of the things we think is that the ocean and atmospheric circulation might have been pretty different 3 million years ago compared to today. And that will help explain some of our observations. So these warmer worlds were kind of had very different dynamics, which is quite interesting.
All right. And Elizabeth, what big things do we know now about icy oceans on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn that we didn't know, say, 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that we just didn't know how complex the chemistry is. And so one of the things that we've found out in the last 20 years is the Cassini spacecraft was at Saturn 20 years ago, and it realized that there's this tiny moon, Enceladus, nearby was kind of spewing ice particles out of its south pole. And this was kind of unexpected. Enceladus is really, really small. As a kind of gauge, it's about the same width as the state of Iowa. So scientists really didn't expect it to be very active. And yet when the Cassini spacecraft went by, they saw these plumes shooting out of the south pole. And so they were like, okay, well, the Cassini spacecraft, it has these dust analyzers and spectrometers on board where we can actually go and sample those plumes. So they did. And when Cassini sampled those plumes, it showed that it actually had surprisingly complex chemistry. They found organics, they found a rich mixture of minerals, including many necessary for life, such as phosphorus. And they also found different minerals that suggests that there might be hydrothermal activity that's occurring underneath. And so this was extremely surprising, and it was really exciting as well, because it showed that these ocean worlds probably do have complex chemistry that might be habitable. Maybe there could be kind of prebiotic molecules being formed in the interiors of these oceans. And so Enceladus was that target, and it's now one of the top priorities for future missions because it was such an interesting finding, despite how small and unassuming it seemed at first.
So Hanu mentioned hydrothermal vents in our ocean. Just in case somebody didn't see our terrific episode about hydrothermal vents, what is that? What is hydrothermal activity? What does that mean?
Hydrothermal vents it's when water and rock react, and specifically it gets really hot, and so you have these hot vents of water and gases spewing out of the seafloor.
Yeah, like hot springs on the seafloor, right?
Yeah, hot springs on the seafloor, and they're really rich in their chemistry, and they often have a lot of different biology that's going on in their rich ecosystems on the seafloor that are important for the total chemistry of the ocean, but also a lot of the life that lives in the ocean and on the seafloor.
All right. Hanu, you've had a long career, but just give us a couple examples of some of the big discoveries or insights that you've helped enable.
Well, given I want to talk about actually two different expeditions. The first one, of course, was the first time we went under ice, and that was in 2007. We went to the Gackel Ridge, and the Arctic was completely ice covered. You make a hole in the ice with your icebreaker. You drop a robot in. It goes down 4,100 meters, and we use it to explore stuff. And the idea originally was to actually go and look for hydrothermal vents there, and we didn't quite find the hydrothermal vents. But as with everything we've learned about our planet, it's so unexplored, even in the 21st century, that we came up with all these surprises. We found that there were these microbial mats sitting on the seafloor right next to these volcanoes.
So that's actually the seafloor, and it's covered with yellow microbes.
Right, that's the seafloor, 4,100 meters below below the surface, on an ice-covered Arctic. Okay, and as I said, we sampled some of these microbial mats, and the biologists were very excited because they were brand new species and also very high up in terms of where they are on the evolutionary tree. So it was a huge surprise to find these and sample these and find new species there.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but how do you get so the Arctic, that's all water, so it's frozen at certain times of the year, right? So how do you get a robot under the ice?
So what you do is you go with an icebreaker, you make a hole in the ice, you drop your vehicle in, and it has an endurance of about 24 hours. It takes about 6 hours to get to the bottom. And then once it gets to the bottom, then it does a mission for about 10 or 15 hours and then starts making its way to the top. Now, what people don't realize is in the Arctic, when we go out on an icebreaker like this, the icebreaker can't always break the ice. It's looking for leads. And the ice is also moving. So over the course of those 24 hours, your icebreaker might have drifted, 10 kilometers away. So then we do this dance where, the helicopter on that icebreaker takes off. It tries to find an open hole somewhere close to where the vehicle is going to come up. We drive the icebreaker there, and then we try and drive the vehicle to that hole as well. What could go wrong? Okay, and so on good days, things work beautifully. On bad days, we have interesting problems.
I probably shouldn't ask this, but have you ever not been able to rescue something from under the ice again?
Well, it's yes. We have the saying that the first law of field robotics says The number of deployments should equal the number of recoveries. But just like with rocket science, if you always follow the first law, if you always recover your robots, that means you aren't pushing the limits again enough. So we have lost robots under the ice. It's okay. Nobody got hurt. It's just a robot. And the scientific knowledge that we got based on the recoveries we made are well worth losing a robot once in a while. It hurts, and and you have lots of stress, but it's all worth it in the end.
All right, tell us about some other findings.
So one other finding I really want to talk about is an expedition we did with some biologists. And looking at the satellite view of the world, we knew that in certain parts that we hadn't really visited a lot in Antarctica, the Danger Islands, there's a channel on the hyperspectral satellites which characterizes penguin poo very well. And so we knew there were penguins there, and we expected to find about 10,000 penguins. So we launched an expedition with a bunch of biologists to go there. And lo and behold, what we found is, and this is one of the islands, this Danger Islands, this is called Brash Island. And, it looks really cool. But as you zoom in and we map this with drones, we realized instead of finding 10,000 penguins, we found 1.5 million penguins. So every single white dot you see is a penguin nesting on an egg. And, that means that every little spot right there, every nest is 2 penguins that we can count. So, that was actually really, really quite amazing to see that we saw, instead of 10,000, we saw 1.5 million penguins. And, whenever we're looking at all these issues with the Arctic and the Antarctic, usually the equipment works really, really well, and we feel happy about it. But the news is unfortunately sad, right? Yes, sea ice is melting. Great. The robot worked well. It characterized sea ice, but it's all melting. Okay. Oh, yes, we went looking for invasive species, and we found invasive crab species climbing up, in Antarctica. So the instruments work well, but the news is not so good. In this case, the instruments worked really well, the robots worked really well, and we had good news when we saw this large penguin colony.
That's great. All right. We have time for some more audience questions, if we've got some, Ken.
Oh, yeah. We have over 100 questions so far. A lot of people are asking about logistics. How do you get all that equipment down to the Allen Hills? How do you get the ice samples back, and how do you keep them cold? And Hanu, how do you get such delicate equipment as an underwater robot to these hard to reach places and keep them operating?
Yeah, so let's start with Sarah, and then we'll go to Hanu.
Sure. So one thing I will say is that the U.S. Antarctic program, which is part of the National Science Foundation, is really kind of amazing with the logistics related to doing Antarctic field work. And so they kind of help us ship our equipment down. There's the ice drilling program, also National Science Foundation, that provides the drills that we use to sample the ice sheet. And then in terms of getting the ice back, they're really good at this as well. So basically, we drill an ice sample, we dug this massive trench. So it stays really cold at the Allen Hills, but there are days where the temperatures will creep up to like -10, which is just too warm for our samples. We want to keep them really cold because that helps preserve the gas records inside. So we store them in this big trench after we drill them. Then we put them in these well-insulated boxes. We hand these boxes off to our twin otter pilots who take a cold deck flight, so they keep the inside of the plane cold as they transit from the Allen Hills to the main station, McMurdo Station, where they then sit in a freezer until they have a big vessel that returns all the samples and other things at the end of the season. So they basically take an entire freezer container, they put all of our ice cores in that, and then they put that entire freezer container on the vessel, and they have a reefer tech that travels with them to Port Hueneme, and then they take a truck, a freezer truck from Port Hueneme to the the NSF ice core facility where they are stored until we can cut them and process them. So it's a whole set of logistics that are
Wow.
really well figured out. Yes, complicated, but luckily they're really good at it.
Yeah, and Hanu.
Well, I envy Sarah because she has the entire USAP behind her. For us, a lot of times, we're going on icebreakers. And the good news is, a lot of this work is collaborative. So we're on a Swedish icebreaker, or we're on the Australian icebreaker, or we're going out with the British, or we're on, of course, the Healy, our US icebreakers. And the logistics of going to these different places are all different and interesting. And we know a lot about customs and and border security as we go through with stuff that looks like, underwater housing looks like a bomb. And so it's an interesting journey every time we go there. But WHOI has an amazing shipping and receiving department. Our techs are amazing, and we get there. The more important thing also is, of course, when we're using these robots, typically if you're using a robot on land, something breaks, you pick up the phone and FedEx will get you a part. FedEx is not available when you're in the middle of the ocean, especially, anywhere in the middle of the ocean. And so we have to carry all our spares, and we have to really understand how to do that. So it's complicated, it's fun, and that's what makes it all doable and fun. Yeah.
All right, Ken, we have time for some more.
Okay. I've got a question from Facebook. Carl is asking, realistically, what do you think would be the oldest ice you'd be able to sample?
Ooh, that's such a good question. So we know that the Antarctic has been continuously glaciated for about 30 million years. I would be shocked if we found a sample that old. But we did find this sample dated just below the 6 million year old sample, or located just below the 6 million year old sample. That didn't have any gas in it. And so we weren't able to date it. We haven't figured out a way to date this sample yet, but from the water isotopes, it looks significantly warmer. And then, of course, we're all placing bets and speculating about how old it is, but I wouldn't be totally surprised if it was about 12 million years old.
Wow.
That's really, this is pure speculation. I don't think we'll find anything as old as 30 million, but I'm hoping that we'll be going back maybe into the Miocene, which is this much warmer climate interval. So maybe 15 would be that would be incredible. That would be really incredible.
I'm going to ask a geeky question because you've said this word twice now. What's an isotope?
Okay, so right, there are different elements, and what make them different are their number of protons, but they're also in the nucleus protons and neutrons, and different elements elements can have a different number of neutrons, so their masses are different, but they have the same kind of chemical properties, and so what we call these are different isotopes of the same element.
Okay, taking people back to chemistry class. All right, Ken, another question? Did we lose Ken? I think you're on mute.
Yeah,
there
of
we
course.
go.
It had to be that I was on mute. So turning our attention back to Europa and to robots, Taylor, age 12, asks, how would you get a rover to another planet? And I'll add, how would you operate it from afar?
Well, we are operating the Mars rover right now at Mars, and that's very doable. What's going to be much more interesting, Taylor, is the Mars rover is on the surface of the planet Mars. When we go to Europa or Enceladus, then we are going to take that rover, or the equivalent of the rover, the underwater vehicle. We're going to drill through the ice, and then the ice is going to freeze back up on top of it. And then we'll be going exploring all over the place. And then we have to somehow get that data back, not just through the water, but also through the ice and then back through space as well. And one of the biggest problems we have when we have our robots underwater is that unlike on land or in air, the electromagnetic spectrum does not work very far. What do I mean by that? We have no Wi-Fi signals. We have no GPS signals. So we have to use sound to really talk underwater. So when we go to these ice-covered planets, we're going to have a system that talks with sound all the way to the surface and then use all the technologies that we're using with the Mars rovers and stuff like that. Elizabeth, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, from the science side of things, it's also really hard if we're talking about going to these missions. So Europa Clipper is just, it's orbiting Jupiter and it's kind of doing these quick little flybys, repeated flybys of Europa. We're not actually landing. So if we wanted to do with a future mission where we actually landed on these moons and then we went into the ice shell and then actually swam around in the ocean, scientifically, one of the bigger things we'll have to deal with is communication delays. So it takes a long, long time based on all the things that Hanu was just talking about to get signals from the robot to Earth. And so if the robot finds something really interesting, it can't just, immediately, like we are right now with this amazing internet and Wi-Fi, I'm talking to you live, you're getting this immediately. We'll have hour delays potentially, where the robot will see something, it'll be like, this is really interesting. Should I do this or should I do this? What instrument should I be using? And who knows if that opportunity will still be there by the time the signal gets all the way to Earth and then all the way back. And so the robot will probably need to figure out different decision processes to figure out what sample should I be taking and what is the best use of the time that I have here and what maybe can wait for a human to decide on. And so these are kind of the decisions that we can test right now with models here at WHOI, where maybe you have a robot in the ocean and you have someone on land, and we can create a fake delay to help us learn how we can solve those problems. And then when we actually go to Europa or Enceladus with these ocean worlds, we'll have practice in doing that, and that technology will be ready.
And and the last thing, which we can only dream of at this point, is one of the reasons we're going to these places is to see if we might find life on other parts of the world, right? And whenever we talk about life, you can take all the pictures you like. All the biologists want samples so that they can do DNA analysis. Okay, so getting a sample in an ocean is hard enough autonomously with these vehicles, right? Getting a sample from a moon from Europa and then somehow getting it back to the surface and back on some other method to all the way back to Earth. That's for not only Elizabeth's generation, but the generation after that as well. That's such a cool problem, and we need to solve it.
All right. Ken, let's do one more.
So this includes a question that we received before the event by email. Somebody asked, is there anything that actually lives inside the ice? Any animals? I know that algae lives in the brine channels in Arctic ice. And then in addition to that, Jeremy's 10-year-old daughter asked, what's the weirdest thing you've encountered drilling into the ice? So two-parter.
Okay, let's start with the life inside the ice. I don't know who wants that one. Sarah, Hanu?
I'm not a biologist, and I'm not gonna go.
Okay. All right, Sarah.
I was going to say the exact same thing. Everyone asks me this, and I need to really get a better answer. There is a lot of bacteria in the ice. I know so little about it, but there are scientists who have basically measured kind of these little tiny bacterial cells. When I was talking about the kind of our samples being contaminated by basal material, and that's why we can't get these accurate CO2 records from the 6 million-year-old sample. One of the questions that we don't know is, we think this is due to respiration, so basically consumption of organic material and CO2 production and oxygen. And we don't know when that's happening. Did that happen? Is that happening today? Are there living bacteria that have been there for millions of years? Talking to biologists, I think they think that's possible. You can basically freeze them in place and then they can kind of come back to life. But I am not a biologist, so it's so interesting, and I wish I was had more informed answers for you about the biology in the ice. The weirdest thing we've found in the ice. I have a friend who, this was not me, but this is a friend who was drilling in this place called Beacon Valley, this rock glacier, and basically it's a glacier that's covered by rocks. It's very interesting. But they drilled down and they accidentally drilled into a mummified penguin. So that's the weirdest thing I think I've ever heard anyone drilling into, which was like a whole issue because you have to get really specific permits to return biological samples. So it turned into a whole logistical mess. But I would say that's the weirdest thing I've heard someone's drilled into.
Interesting. Hanu, any weird stories of things found in the ice?
Oh, there's one thing we should point out, actually, is instead of just talking about weird things in ice, is I think, all of us who go, whether we are oceanographers or polar scientists or space scientists, we're all normal people, right? And so there's, we're talking about all the science that happened. We're out for 40 days or 50 days on an expedition. And some of the weirdest things that happened, a long time, in the 90s when I was going out, we didn't have internet on the ships and we didn't get news on the ships. We'd get a little news digest. And the stupidest thing that would happen to me was I would come back home and then I would talk about this rock singer and they would all look at me funny and say, that person's passed away 5 years ago. And there would be these holes in, popular life, which just exist because there was no internet and there was no way of figuring out what's going on in the real world when you're out and isolated. So that's kind of weird. And so it still happens. All right. I'll make some comment about something and they'll say, everybody will look at me funny. So that's, that's something. But the other part of it is also to realize that we actually have a lot of fun on ice. Okay. It's not just, yes, we work real hard. Okay. But, you make your best friends on ice when you're on expeditions. It's fun. That's why, oh yeah,
there we go.
Yeah, we got into this mode where we were playing Scrabble a lot on the icebreaker. And then when we got a break, we had to take our Scrabble board on ice and, and play Scrabble on the ice. So there's all sorts of fun things we do too. And this is, of course, my classic picture. After a hot day, we all got ice cream from the galley, and we all had ice cream on the ice. So yeah, it's fun. And one of the reasons we do it is because we care about the science. The other reason we do all the stuff we do is because it's fun.
Pretty amazing adventure. All right, we're getting close to running out of time. So before we wrap up for tonight, I want to end with one last question for each of you, which is what's next? What are the big questions we still need to answer about icy places and what technologies do we need to get those answers? We've touched on a little bit of that, but let's have Elizabeth go first and then Sarah and then Hanu.
Yeah, so I'd say that the kind of next thing is Europa Clipper arriving, and that'll tell us how thick it'll help us understand potentially how thick the ice shell is. And then beyond that, future missions. So this video that you're seeing here, it's a concept video of potentially a drill that could go into the ice. And so in grad school, I was on a concept team that looked at what would be the kind of science objectives and the technological challenges of if we were to go to Europa and drill through the ice, what would that vehicle look like? And so right now we're just kind of flying by Europa, but as we've been talking about here today, the goal is to get underneath the ice. And so we'll hopefully get underneath the ice and we'll be able to sample the ocean and we'll figure out, are there hydrothermal vents there? What kind of chemistry exists underneath the ice? How is it interacting with the ice? And then maybe one day we'll find out if there's life or not down there.
Exciting stuff. All right, Sarah.
Okay, yeah. So I guess this is something that's not next, but it's going on right now, which is really exciting. So our team, we kind of focus on these discontinuous snapshots of very old ice, but continuous ice core records, where we get these continuous records of CO2 levels, have only gone back 800,000 years. And again, there's this really important climate transition that happened about 1 million years ago, where we have this shift in the pacing and the intensity of our ice ages. And there have been big international kind of efforts to extend this continuous record. And our European colleagues just, I think, 2 weeks ago, finished drilling their continuous record. From what we've heard, they think it goes back 1.2 million years ago, and might even be a little bit older than that, which is really exciting. We'll find out more when they bring the ice home and start really analyzing it. I think 4 days ago, our Australian colleagues just started drilling their continuous record, somewhat nearby to the European effort. But we're really excited to see what they found. We're really rooting for them. And I think there will be a lot of really interesting science coming out of not only our project, but these international efforts as well.
And why is it so hard to get a continuous core that goes back further? Is it the logistics of getting a core not breaking, or what is it?
It's just this kind of like, you need this very perfect conditions to get kind of stratigraphically intact.
I see.
That doesn't melt at the bottom. So the ice sheet can't be too thick, but then you want it to have constant accumulation. And so there's just like a really narrow range of sites where you can find continuous records, and very few of them go back that far.
Makes sense. All right, Hanu, you get the last word.
So, what's kind of interesting to think about from sensing and a robotic and purely science standpoint is that if you think about a lot of the measurements that we're making them in what we call austral summers. So, summer in the northern hemisphere is when we go to the Arctic, and our winter, their summer in the southern hemisphere is when we go to the Antarctic. I think it would be really cool to extend our records and our expeditions and our sensors and robots to work through austral winters. We've kind of done it in a few little areas, but to really do that in a big way is a significant challenge, and it's something which I think a lot of people are looking forward to.
Would we do that like with people going, or would it be somehow remotely operating robots
Well,
to go?
the one thing we like to do is say, look, let's have the robots do the dull, the dirty, and the dangerous. And when it's nighttime and it's -60 without wind chill, that's dull and that's dirty and that's dangerous. So let's have the robots do some of that. It's not easy. We will have human interaction, and the pioneers are the ones who are going to suffer while we're trying to test out this technology. But that's what we want to aim for eventually.
Makes sense. All right. Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for tonight. I want to say a big thank you to Sarah Shackleton, Hanumant Singh, and Elizabeth Spiers for joining us to talk about ice. Thank you also to all my WHOI colleagues who've been working very hard behind the scenes to make this event possible, and to everyone who joined us on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. Thank you. Tonight's event was the first in our 7th season of WHOI's Ocean Encounters events. Our next one is coming up, and it's about the urban ocean. That's going to be on February 26th. So please watch our website, whoi.edu, for more details about that. In the meantime, you might want to take a look at the very cool merchandise at WHOI's online store. That's at shop.whoi.edu. You get a 10% event discount for joining us tonight. Just type in the discount code ICE. If you enjoyed tonight's Ocean Encounters program, you can be part of WHOI's solution-based approach to ocean science. If you're already a WHOI member, thank you very much. As you know, a benefit of WHOI membership is receiving our award-winning Oceanus member magazine. If you're not yet a WHOI member, please consider joining so you'll never miss an issue. You'll also get other great benefits, and you'll be providing crucial support for our outreach and our science. Memberships start at just $40 a year. The average gift is $120, but any amount helps. On behalf of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, thank you and good night.
Out where the seas are the deepest and the mysteries the greatest lies our future. The ocean is our last unexplored, ungoverned frontier. The life support system for our planet, inextricably linked to our climate and weather, and to the lives and livelihoods of countless people around the globe. But even against the ocean's vastness, humankind can be a formidable force. What happens next demands action that is rooted in scientific understanding and unvarnished truth, because our world stands at a fork in the road. In one direction, we watch the ocean being catastrophically altered beyond its ability to sustain us. In the other, understanding outraces exploitation, and we help steward and protect this most precious shared resource. What will be the legacy of the 21st century? Together, we can unleash the world's most creative minds, passionately dedicated to ocean science, engineering, education, and policy. Together, we can provide the expertise needed to know what works and a trusted voice to present the facts as we uncover them. Together, we can shape the future. We can inform governments, businesses, and conservationists. We can generate new knowledge in service of society. We can be the catalyst for change. It is more than our responsibility. It is the defining moment of our generation. We are explorers, students, and stewards of the ocean, and this is our time.